of repair, but a humble process where we can learn together. So I see we have about 50 minutes left, and in the last part of our time, we have three panelists who I've asked to have just a conversation together to keep this kind of informal and conversational, and invite your questions in the chat or at the end if we have time for Q&A together. I recognize that many of you bring experience and also mistakes made in the area of relationship building with Indigenous peoples who could also share potentially on a panel. But I want to just use this time to resource us and to listen to Sherry Hostetler, Luke Gasho, and Karen Kaufman-Wall in conversation from their different experiences and their ongoing journey of learning and relationship with Indigenous peoples. And before I invite them to share some responses to some questions that I've prepared, I just want to give kind of a preface or maybe a caveat, because there are some conversations that are more maybe external and bring in outside speakers, like we had last time with Steve Heinrichs and Adrian Jacobs. And I felt like this conversation could be more internal, that we don't necessarily need an Indigenous educators or others to come in, but really for us to build a space and talk about how can we grow in respectful relationships with Indigenous groups, especially those whose lands we live on. And I just wanted to be clear up front before we jump into the panel space that relationship building is not actually the ultimate purpose of the Repair Network. Some might get confused because we're focusing on building relationships and themes related to that in this call, but I just want to say that it's actually not one of our 7 steps, as you'll notice, that are part of our sort of framework that we're working with. It can be, I think, deeply transformative work of building relationships with Indigenous peoples, but from what I've learned so far in our work as a coalition and our analysis, as a coalition, our ultimate goal is not relationship building itself, though that is part of the journey, but it's actually dismantling and unraveling the systems of violence that continue to dispossess Indigenous peoples of their lands around the world. And that's the church's work to do, and then also settler work to do, especially white settlers. And so our ultimate goal is really creating conditions for peace so that as the prophet Isaiah says, that Indigenous communities can live under their own vines and fig trees. So we long for and we work towards that kind of jubilee, as Adrian Jacobs and Steve Heinrichs encouraged us to at our annual meeting. Return of land to Indigenous caretakers, release from the enslavement and oppression of extractive industries, for example, rest for the earth, redistributive justice, restoration of shalom. Which is a deeper relational framework than simply going and building friendships. So Sarah Augustine often compares our work to the apartheid struggle of South Africa. You didn't have to be in relationship with a Black South African, she says, to know that apartheid was immoral and to pressure the system to change. So in a similar way, the doctrine of discovery is an unjust, immoral system that we can be part of, pressuring to change, even if we're not in direct relationship. So all that to say, we're not asking each of you to go out after this and try to make friends with Indigenous peoples as an end goal, because, in some of your contexts, that's not always possible. And sometimes it's not even asked for or wanted by different Indigenous groups, depending on your context. So I would just want to nuance the conversation. And also just to say, our coalition does hold relationships with Indigenous partners like Save Oak Flat, like the Apache Stronghold that Carol talked about, or Kakushtal, or Makoche Ikichupe. And we also seek out Indigenous advisory councils for accountability, especially for our resources. So just by being part of the Repair Network, you are already in relationship by proxy. And all that said, if it is possible in your context as part of the broader work of repair, that's great. And we want to equip you to do so with care. So that's why we're hosting this conversation. And we received some questions from members of the Repair Network about respectful relationship building, since it can take some time and a long, slow journey to learn the cultural protocols and just different respectful ways of communicating, for example, cross-culturally with Indigenous groups. And so yeah, we want to open up this panel conversation. Forgive me, panelists, for taking a little bit of time to give a long intro, but I felt like that was important before we jumped in to hearing your responses. So I would love for each of you to introduce yourselves. Maybe we can start with Sherry, and then Karen, and then Luke. And if you don't get to every question, like if each of you doesn't have to answer every question, if you don't have a big response, that's okay. We can wait till the next one. I have about 5 questions or so for the next 45 minutes or 40 minutes or so, just to give you a sense of time. So if you could introduce yourselves, Sherry, Karen, and Luke, and maybe just share just really briefly, what are some openings that you've found, maybe regionally, for learning about Indigenous groups and ways that you have formed connections.
Well, thank you, Katarina, and thank you all for being here. I know for some of you, this is sort of like more the end of your day than it is for me here in California. So I'm especially grateful that you all showed up. I'm the pastor of lead pastor at First Mennonite Church of San Francisco and one of the founders of this coalition. And so it makes my heart especially glad to see all of you here. This was a dream we had 7 years ago, and you are in many respects the fulfillment of that dream. So thank you. We are blessed that we have a Nez Perce woman in our church who is a professor of Native American Studies at UC Berkeley. So she's got a lot of connections with local Ohlone people. And so even though we'd had connections, I would say, with sort of Indigenous activists through some of our work we have done, like around climate change activism, Beth really connected us with these 2 men named Louis and Vincent, who are local Ohlone leaders who have a mission to, they run this place called Ohlone Cafe, or Cafe Ohlone, which is a decolonization cafe where they have people, it's in Berkeley, and they have people come and they're chefs and they prepare this beautiful food that's made from all these local ingredients. And they like go out and harvest salt from the bay in these traditional ways that they've done for like literally thousands of years, and then use that salt on like these luscious like acorn brownies that they make, with salt on top. And they actually are doing this as a way of wanting to say to people in this area, we are here and we have these traditions and these life ways that we actually want to share with you. In their Ohlone Cafe, they would also like do this education, and we would actually play traditional Ohlone games. It was really cool. But anyways, they were invited to come to our church for an Indigenous Peoples Day service. And I really felt like Beth, who is a Nez Perce woman, was such an important conduit, because it can be really tricky to bring Native people who don't identify as Christian to a Christian service. There's just so many different landmines that you could step on during such a service. And Beth really helped us craft a service that was going to be respectful of them and not be honestly offensive to them. So I'm really grateful for that. And they had such a great experience that they said they want to come back again. So they came back again, and we were going to bring them back again, but then COVID hit. But the cool thing that's come out of that is like 1 or 2 people from our church have become key volunteers for them at Cafe Ohlone. And I also feel like it's just, we have this now network of mutual respect with these 2 men. And I think it has just opened up other avenues that we could, for being in, like for having these local connections that we didn't have before. So I'm really grateful for that.
Thanks, Sherry. Yeah. How about you, Karen? If you want to share an introduction and then just connections that have really shaped you.
Yikes, I was hoping Luke was going to go next. I'm Karen Kaufman Wall, and I am located on land that is traditional to the Kanza, the Kiowa, the Osage, the Wichita, even the Comanche and the Cheyenne, and depending on how far out in the land that is currently the state of Kansas you want to go. I am living in North Newton, Kansas. I work for Mennonite Central Committee Central States. I've worked for Mennonite Central Committee for like 23 years or something like that. And I've been doing this work related to Indigenous communities for almost 20 years now. And honestly, I just can't, this is not fake humility. I told Katerina, I'm not sure what I have to share with this group. I feel like I'm still just so much learning. Mistakes. I've probably made so many. Repeat for me again, Katerina, the question you would like me to cover right now.
Yeah, maybe just as a intro question, kind of connections that I know you've been part of the Indigenous Visioning Circle, and just sort of connections that you've made with Indigenous people, as well as, I know it's a double question, I apologize, like opportunities or openings that you've found. Like some groups have a hard time sort of knowing like what's an appropriate just starting place, like just beginning this work, like where do we start if we would like to seek relationship and seek if that's wanted from Indigenous groups, like where have you started, you know?
Yeah, super tricky questions. So first of all, let me just say that I feel like I have been incredibly blessed to have opportunities through my role at MCC to be in spaces that I would not have otherwise been able to be in, and some that were really transformative in my life and in this work. Yes, with the Indigenous Visioning Center, which is name change, Indigenous Visioning Circle, which is a program of MCC Central States, and the opportunity to be in spaces facilitated by the late Ruth Yellowhawk, somebody I learned just a great deal about process and about entering into a different worldview and a different way of being together. Which is just was so transformative for me, like slow way down. She always said, go slow to go fast. And it took me probably admittedly years to really understand and appreciate what she was saying. So yeah, and having been able to be in other organizational spaces that are public spaces, but not everybody goes to, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, or being part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission sessions in Canada, or part of the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, all spaces that I just have learned incredible amounts in and just been really grateful for. That said, I'm often asked, because of my role, and I'm interacting with various groups from across about a 16-state region, or from other parts in the country too, to be totally honest. And what I find is people asking for that kind of relational question. And how can we connect with Indigenous groups? I get that question actually fairly often. And it's a real tricky one, because I feel like there have been times where I have really functioned as a gatekeeper, to be somewhat protective of my Indigenous relationships, because I just know that many of the people that I'm connected to have been inundated and overwhelmed by what is sort of like can appear to be a real invasive or transactional kind of relationship, where white folks expect a lot from Indigenous folks to teach us, come and be with us, let us know about this. We would like to, be invited. We would like to have this relationship with you that is transformational and so forth. And that may not be a mutual desire. And so sometimes I've been straight up asked by some of my friends and colleagues to intercede in those situations and kind of redirect, which is kind of a strange place to be and a little bit awkward, but I guess I try to do that when I'm asked. Yeah, and so I guess one thing that I try, maybe I'm going to wrap it up now. I'll just say that one thing that I do try to direct people to is the idea of go to the public spaces where Indigenous communities are inviting people to, rather than seeking something that's special for you or your congregation or specially made for you or a really impactful, meaningful relationship. And we know those stories, and they're important. I could tell one of those with Florence and Pauline, I guess, but there are public powwows, and many nations are very welcoming of having people from the outside come and attend their powwows, or they have, there's maybe public centers or activities or things where there are a lot of events for public. And I always try to encourage people to start there, like start with just some passive learning, just show up when you're invited and listen and learn and be a respectful guest, rather than expecting some kind of reciprocal relationship to begin with. A lot of these communities are struggling with a lot of their own issues. And so to additionally burden them with needing to meet our expectations is just inappropriate. So just to be able to be present and show up, I guess that's where I'd start.
Thanks, Karen. That's super helpful. How about you, Luke? If you could share an intro to yourself and your role or past roles and connections that you've found or opportunities for relationship building.
Well, I'm grateful to be able to share this evening. I live in Goshen, Indiana, and we are on Potawatomi and Miami land, woodlands peoples before those more identified group that we think of today. And I resonate a lot with what both Karen and Sherry have talked about, these points that we need to pay attention to, and what does it really mean to build relationship? And Karen, you talked about a number of those pieces. And I too, in some of the work that I've done, feel like I need to protect the people I've gotten to know from people who want to just kind of almost barge in there. It feels like barging in from that settler kind of approach that happens so frequently. So just a little of who I am. For 22 years, I was the executive director of Mary Lee Environmental Learning Center of Goshen College, and provided leadership for the founding of Mennonite Creation Care Network. So connecting to the full of creation has been important, and that's actually a link that has brought me into the work of dismantling the doctrine of discovery, and that important principle of the land is kin. Ties in with creation care and then people and their intersection with everything related to that. So one of the things that I think is really important is get to know your land well. Land shapes people, and that's an indigenous principle that Westerners have often forgotten or just never learned. At least in the North American experience. And so one of the things in my own learning the land well where I live here in Goshen means I've played around with looking at old maps. And in the process of looking at old maps, I learned that there was a trail that passed very close to where I'm sitting here this evening, about a half mile to the east of me. That passed all the way from what we now call Fort Wayne to what we now call Chicago. And this was a major trail used for centuries, millennia, dating back probably to the Woodlands people following the Ice Age, because we're talking about two major parts of two different watersheds and a linkage between them. So I could see this trail marked on some of the first survey maps, and it's like, wow, what do I need to know about that? So I've looked at that particular piece closely, and then realized that this trail goes right through the heart of Goshen, like literally going through the county courthouse property, which is not marked at all. It goes right through the Greencroft Retirement Center, which is a major retirement center here in Goshen. And it also passes in the city of Elkhart between the Mennonite Church office building and the Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary chapel. And so just kind of being aware of this, long story, but just to say, what would it be like to mark this trail, to bring it to the attention of people as a way of drawing our local community into knowing that this is Potawatomi Miami land, and learning history from a Miami and Potawatomi point of view, and then hopefully drawing a lot of people into reparative work beyond that. So it's kind of an educational approach. So Eileen Sainer and Linda Hollinger Jansen, who are both on this call this evening too, are part of a committee of 8 of us who are working together on this trail marking project. That has taken us to a number of different connections. One of those connections, the Trail of Death experience, Katerina's played a major role with the seminary and helping with that tour, and some people in this evening's group have been participants in that. But the people, the Potawatomi people who were forced to march from here to Kansas and then on to Oklahoma in a later time period, they're the people who this land belongs to, where we're sitting. So we have been in conversation with the director of the Cultural Center there in Shawnee, Oklahoma. So the Citizen Potawatomi Nation group, we've been in conversation with them, and they've been, the director Kelly and the curator Blake have been very helpful in thinking through how we work on some things. It helps us in our work with decolonizing concepts. It's interesting, it kind of moves us into this professional side of how do you tell history. And so one of the things is there's a book that I have here that's written specifically for how do you tell Native American stories in museums, and it's written by Indigenous people. Kelly and Blake actually write one of the chapters, and that's been helpful for us to think through, like, so what does this mean? What are the pitfalls to avoid? And the council, both from Kelly and Blake, as well as professional materials like this book, help us think through how we work on it. We'd love to be out there putting signs up right now, right? But this goes slow, Karen, right? Is just so important as we work on figuring out naming things, language things. But there's a lot of energy. A lot of people are very interested in this, and I'm hopeful for what that can bring. So that's kind of a quick introduction to a particular activity that we're doing here, and this is part of that whole relationship building piece. And Katerina, maybe just a quick share is that, relationship building is so much broader than what we often think about. And so Randy Woodley, who's been an advisor to us in our resource work in the coalition, has this particular slide in one of his presentations where he talks about restoring relationships. And if you look at this, there's no place that says go out and find an Indigenous person to have coffee with, right? That's not what it says. And and having coffee with Randy Woodley is fine, or other Indigenous people, but recognizing that the restoring of relationship is much, much broader, as you see. And so some of the work we're doing, I think, relates to a number of these 4 major points that are expressed here. And maybe the third one in particular is the decolonizing process as we work within our region and watershed.
Thanks for that slide, Luke. And I would love to, I think I have a copy of it, but we can send that out. Would love to send that out to the group afterwards, along with the 4-part slide that he has, I think that we've represented in some of our resources as well, on the kind of cycle or spiral of this work. There it is. Yeah. So this has really influenced our Cultural Change Committee work and coalition work too. Yeah, thank you for that. And I think it points to the relationship building in terms of kind of personal relationships, maybe one aspect of it, but this is deeper kind of shalom centered healing work that we're called to, especially where we're able to advocate as those in power, or those who have power, to shift in the repair, like he has reparations in there as rehumanizing the oppressed and oppressor, I think is really important in that process.
And part of our work, it involves all parts of this paradigm that Randy developed, but the memorializing concept with this trail and its long history in our area is part of it.
Thank you, Luke. Well, I'd like to maybe shift into just sharing some of the, maybe I'll combine 2 questions and just ask what challenges you've encountered in relationships building, and or what mistakes have you made, because I feel like it's so important and really what's the word, gets at some of our ego that wants to do things right when we're able to share what mistakes we've made and maybe laugh at them and learn from them to move forward. But if you'd like to share challenges that you've encountered along the way, and or any mistakes that you'd be open to sharing that we can learn from in the spirit of growth. I'll start again with Sherry.
A challenge has been that, I don't even know if I want to call it a challenge. It turns out there's actually two different Ohlone groups, at least 2, in our area. One of them is headed up by this woman who's a force of nature, who started up a land trust that a lot of people give like kind of like a real rent thing to. And it turns out that the other Ohlone group actually doesn't recognize what she's doing as actually attached to the Ohlone tribe, and she's not affiliated with sort of the official. So what do you know? Ohlone people are as different and have their own tensions, just like Mennonites do. So I feel like sometimes I think the learning from that is sometimes, I've talked a lot with Sarah about this, like sometimes white people don't want to move forward on any action until all Native people agree. And that will never happen, just as we could never move forward as a Mennonite church or even as a congregation if we all agreed. So I think, we've just had to navigate that. Some people in our church want to support this land trust that's run by this one woman, and some people feel more drawn. Anyways, it's just a tension we hold, knowing that we don't know. We're just holding that tension, I guess I would say. The mistake, the one thing I actually was thinking of is, I'm from that Hostetler line where the whole Hostetler Indian massacre story, which some of you might be familiar with. It's this big story among Amish and Mennonites. And I look back on the ways that I have told that story without setting it in the proper context of basically my ancestors being a part of what I would now call a settler colonial project. Words that I did not have, 20 years ago. But I look back on the way I told that story and really view that as a mistake in terms of not setting it within this wider context of systemic violence, honestly, that my family was involved in. And instead, the story as told was always focusing on the violence that was done to us by these Native Americans, and Jacob Hostetler choosing non-violence in that setting. And that's really, I would never tell that story the same way.
Thanks, Sherry. How about you, Karen?
Oh gosh, mistakes. How much time do we have?
If you could
How,
squeeze it all into like
how
2 minutes.
long is the call? Gosh, I don't know. I wish I had asked for these questions ahead of time. That would have been helpful. Sherry touched on such an important one, the whole idea about, Native politics. They may joke about it together, but it is a real thing, just like it is in white communities. And that whole white supremacy culture tendency of perfectionism and wanting to do it the right way, or people wanting to work on their land acknowledgement and really want to make sure they've got the right groups represented, and did we cover everybody, and did we get, we don't want to do it wrong, and all of those are trappings that we so often get stuck in, that need to try to do it right. And then it's paralyzing, right? So then we don't want to do anything unless we can do it just right. That's one. I think the other thing I was thinking about was the reality of trauma, and how when relating to, well, first of all, what I would say is thinking about relating to Indigenous peoples, and maybe holding, for those of us who've done the work to respect Indigenous cultures, we may expect that Indigenous peoples live up to the ideals of their culture without recognizing the generational, intergenerational historical trauma and how that affects individual and community functioning, and how difficult that can make relationships. And then let's be clear to recognize the historical and intergenerational trauma that we as white folks and settler folks carry, and needing to be more present and aware of that in our relationships. So I guess I just wanted to name that as something that is an ongoing challenge. We're not engaging in this work in an ideal world. We're engaging in the reality of in our present time, with all of the history and context and our individual stuff, which is really present at all times. I don't know, those are the first two things that come to my mind.
Thank you, Karen.
Yeah, one of the things about mistakes, because they do happen, and as Randy Woodley told us when we were working on the reparative justice resources, he said, act, and you will make mistakes, and that's good. Then you simply, spend time. Well, he said, maybe you just need to laugh at yourself a bit first, and then, get back on track, debrief and work again, which is really great advice to kind of get us off this thing, like we're not going to do anything because we might make a mistake or we want it perfect. I mean, in our work with the project of marking the trail, it's been helpful to have the insights coming from like Kelly Mostaller, who has worked with a lot of different groups, even within an Indigenous museum setting, to come up with the right kinds of combinations. Being aware of names and what's the right name, so that, the Potawatomi were forced from this particular area in 1838. and have been living away from this region. And the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi, just to the north of us in southern Michigan, their dialects end up being different, right? And so they don't pronounce words the same way, and therefore they don't get written or spelled the same way. And so, how do you work? Who does the mediating work in figuring out even what's the right word to put on a sign when you're representing Potawatomi peoples? And then, of course, we have Miami people to the south and east of us as well. And so making those connections. One of the wonderful things, though, that we learned just last week in a call with Kelly and Blake is that they, along with the Pokagon Band, a number of people from the Miami of Oklahoma and other Miami groups have been interacting together professionally in advising even a large Indigenous related project at the Indiana University campus, as well as several others. And so they are in this dialogue, which they are willing to share with us, what from their relationship they have already built. And so that's a real blessing to have kind of that already underway for us. So that won't necessarily keep us from making mistakes, but it's certainly nice to have that kind of input.
Thank you, Luke. So helpful. My next question comes from some questions that have been raised in the Repair Network around cultural appropriation and sort of the nuances of that, what that is, what that isn't. So, for example, many of us would probably know, like, okay, we're not going to dress up, as Indians for Halloween or that kind of thing. Like, there's extreme examples, but then there's some areas where congregations have questions, like, the hymns in the Mennonite hymnal written by Indigenous peoples, like, when are those appropriate to sing, or how do you introduce those? Or one congregation brought up, like, playing powwow music during an education time, or like what I just did in the beginning, I shared some Indigenous artists' music in the beginning. So there's questions around art and music and sharing, and who has the power to share and who might not. So I think my question is, what are ways of appreciating without appropriating Indigenous cultural practices, like art or music or clothing, or even, philosophies or rituals in our congregations and communities. And if you have any examples you can share. I know, especially Sherry, we've been in conversation about how your church uses the hymns in the hymnal, and would love to maybe start with you in that story if you're open to sharing.
Yeah, sure. There is not one answer that covers all these things. I'm just going to speak briefly from my experience and hope that it's helpful. So in terms of hymns, I think what we've decided as a congregation is that if the hymns are in our hymnal, then it's because Native people wanted them to be there. We actually contacted the person who was the editor of what we used to call the Blue Hymnal, and asked them about how they went through that process of selecting hymns that come from the Native American tradition. We provide as much context as possible when we're singing these hymns, though. We try to, find out as much as we can. There used to be something called the Hymnal Companion that was actually really helpful in terms of providing some context, but sometimes going online, I find a lot of really great context about the hymns. I will also say that we're blessed to have Beth, this Nez Perce woman, in our church, because she explained to us, like, something that we often briefly say before we sing some Native American hymns, is that they often start up high, and that is like the idea that you're calling up to, like, the heavens, the spirit world, but then they come down at the end, they come down and are grounded into the earth. And so just even to give a little bit of that kind of background, I just think it sort of contextualizes the song, that this is a song that maybe came from a particular people. Anyways, context, as much as possible, without, slowing down your service incredibly through just a lot of words. I will say, I've talked with Sarah Augustine about like, if a Native artist is selling jewelry, dream catchers, her feeling, and this is one Native woman's opinion, is that it's perfectly fine to purchase that art. You are supporting artists by doing that, and they are selling it to you because they want it to be bought and worn or used. But I think it's really important to absolutely make sure that's actually a Native person that's selling that. Sometimes you don't know that when it just says it's Native made. With music, not hymns, but this has come up when Sarah and I were coming up with music for our podcast that we do. Basically what Sarah has said, and again, this is one Native woman's take on this, she would never use any kind of Native ceremonial music in the podcast for any reason, like drumming, etc. She said that music has a very particular ceremonial purpose. And so she just felt like it's off limits for her and for us. There are, however, a lot of contemporary Native musical artists that are making great music, like Katarina said, and we have used their music in our podcast. A Tribe Called Red is one that I particularly like, but there's lots of others. And so I would say that about music. And then last thing I will say is I would personally not engage or do in my congregation, let's say, any Indigenous art form, drumming, beadwork, without having been explicitly taught that by an Indigenous person who then gave me permission to do that in my setting. I just would not ever do that. And I think that, it'd be another thing to have an Indigenous person come and teach that if they wanted to your community. But I really stay away from that because I feel like I just don't, I think that's hard to do. And other people may have other ways of dealing with it. That's just where I've landed with that.
Thank you, Sherry. I'll open it up, Karen or Luke, if you want to add anything.
Man, those were good things, Sherry. That's really helpful. And you're right. This is another one of those things where you will never find Indigenous agreement on these things, right? So it's it is a tricky thing. Somebody once told me, like, how would you feel about seeing a group of people who are just playing around with communion and taking communion for fun, like they're just making it kind of a fun ceremony, like if they don't, like, just try to imagine something that is sacred to you and imagine how it would be to see somebody that's just kind of playing with it and they don't really seem to understand what it's about, but they're just trying it on, and maybe that would feel fine to you, but for some people that would be really, really difficult. And so again, understanding that for many Indigenous ceremonies, music, art, etc., there is deep spiritual meaning, and to engage in those things oblivious to that deeper meaning is can be really harmful. So hey, let's have our Sunday school class make dream catchers. I personally, I would not do that because there's a lack of understanding about it. I think as long as we are working at really deeply understanding versus taking it on and doing it ourselves, I think that's a little bit of a principle that I would hold. And of course, there is always the importance of crediting, acknowledging where this comes from, what we know about it, why we think we want to engage in this, what do we hope to get from, why is it important for us to do this here? Like, why are we doing this instead of just talking about it or something? And like, I think one thing that it falls into that is like the circle process. And the circle process is something that is traditional to many Indigenous cultures around the globe. But I always try, when utilizing it, to make sure that we spend enough time to acknowledge that this is from Indigenous genius that we are learning, and we are trying to learn from that wisdom, and what we hope to gain from that. And we're not going to do it necessarily in the same way, but we're going to try to learn from that wisdom and do it in our way. There's a white woman from Minnesota, Kay Pranis, who has made quite a bit of money with a book, and has for many years stated that she was given specific permission by an Indigenous person to do this. That recently that Indigenous person has come forward and said, actually, no, I didn't. And so, that's the kind of example of like, that's literally like profiting off of somebody else's culture that has been at the same time stripped away from them. So it gets very complex, but I think keeping a respectful learning mindset versus taking it on ourselves, and certain things that we just have to understand. We don't understand that, and let's just leave that alone. That's kind of how I feel about it.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, and for bringing in restorative justice and circle process into that, because I think that's another great example where it's not something maybe physical or material like a dream catcher to look at, but it's a more cultural and philosophical genius to learn from and to acknowledge. Yeah. Luke, is there anything that you'd want to add in our last couple minutes?
Well, there are a lot of pieces in our ongoing work with this trail work. One of the pieces is, whose story are you telling, and what's the voice that's telling it? And that's where it's been helpful to have Blake, for example, say to us, well, we have the stories, we can share them with you, which is very helpful to us. But we have a lot of pieces along the way to figure out here, to make sure that we're not appropriating Indigenous things for our own benefit somehow. We have a website that we know we need to have to help tell more stories. We have ideas for putting up kiosks, and then what kinds of messages are on the kiosks. So there's a lot of communication work, and with a real strong desire to decolonize what we do and set a really good example. It's also great that here in Elkhart County, where we live, the Historical Museum, they have worked hard on decolonizing language used in their displays, historical displays, et cetera, too. So it's nice to have other partners who are paying attention to these kinds of things that can help inform us in this work. And I think that also helps us in the church. So we're kind of working on this broader community project, but also within the church to do the storytelling in appropriate ways.
Thanks, Luke. I think, yeah, this is just, I'm just aware this is just the tip of the iceberg in this conversation. And there's so much more and so many questions I want to ask each of you further. But I think we can just leave it at that this is a continued conversation, an ongoing one. And I invite you all to share resources like we talked about earlier on. I can share a digest of links to articles in my once a month email. And I also want to just lift up in the land acknowledgement guide that Rachel Weasley really took a lead on editing. She kind of collected in conversation with anti-racist educators some just practices around values and protocol to keep in mind. And so there's a free download of that on our website, or I can send it to you by PDF with some practices if you're engaged in relationship building. And just hearing some common themes here with Luke and Sherry and Karen's sharing. And I'm sure there's many other good resources out there as well through MCC Central States, or I know there's Paths for Peacemaking with Host Peoples, with MC Canada, and a number of other great resources on these themes. I do want to honor your time. And so if you want to hang out for another 5 minutes and have questions for panelists, or another 5 or 10, and just want to chat or share your own experiences, feel free to stay on. And panelists, no pressure if you can't stay. But I do want to just give folks a heads up before you get off about our next meetings. We'll have one in March 1st at the same time, June 2nd. And then we have an annual meeting, and you're welcome to plan on coming in person. We can share more about that on times and opportunities to come. That first Friday, we're going to have a special convening of our repair network, and be able, if different COVID variants allow, to be in person, and have a hybrid option by Zoom, hopefully too. So if you want to mark those in your calendar, next March, we're going to be having a conversation about including restitution in church budgets. And we'll be hearing from Reverend Jimbear Jacobs, who's a Mohican pastor in the Twin Cities. Christy on this call, Zabriskie knows him well. And he actually first inspired me, and I think some others in this repair network, to put this idea into practice through a talk that he gave at a conference I was part of. So I credit that idea with Jimbear and perhaps others. And he'll share, hopefully, with some panelists of congregations who have been putting restitution in their budget, like Shalom Mennonite Fellowship and others, and just the process and the tough conversations and the good connections that they've been making through that process, for us to learn the why and the how behind that. Before folks jump off, I would love to get a screenshot. So if you'd like to come on camera, great. If not, that's okay too. And I'll just take a screenshot with your permission. If you would not like to be on, just turn your video off, and put on you have a built-in mirror here, so do whatever primping you need. Karen. Okay, Carol Rose, oh my goodness. Okay, 1, 2, 3. And I'll do one more of our next screen. Okay, 1, 2, and 3. All right, thank you, everyone. So like I said, feel free to stick around for another couple minutes, and we can share questions, reflections on what this conversation brought up. And I just want to give a big thank you to panelists for your time, for your work, and for your offering and opening your vulnerable reflections and mistakes and challenges and learnings with us. And I feel like all of us probably can relate to what Karen shared about we're in the very beginning of what feels like a lifelong journey with this. So much gratitude and thank you. Thank you, everyone. And yes, if there are any questions, feel free to stick around. And if not, that's okay. Sherry, Luke, Karen, oh, such good words. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for asking.
I have a question, which is why I stuck around.
And
I have
one comment. Sorry, Eileen.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Would you all prefer that I stop recording? If you'd like to ask more personal questions, I can stop recording, or else I can keep it on the recording.
Yeah, it's not, I think you could keep recording.
Okay.
Because it's about a book. It's about a book that I actually found it when I went to the Pokagon Band powwow. They had a wonderful book kiosk selling all kinds of lots of kids' books, which of course I'm interested in. So the one of several that I picked up there is called, the title is Giving Thanks, a Native American Good Morning Message. And it's by Jake Swamp and Eric Printup. And so this is the Thanksgiving address of the Iroquois people from the out east. And Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about this address in one of the chapters of her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. It's, and the title of that chapter is Allegiance to Gratitude. So there are lovely bold illustrations, a couple sentences per page, just something to obviously use with young children. And to me, even though it says it's a message or an address, to me, it's a prayer. And so when I see this book, I think, oh, well, maybe that'd be something to use in children's time. It has nice pictures, and I have the text in front of me, so I'll read a few sentences of it. And then I'd like to hear what you think about whether that's an appropriate thing to use or not, like in worship or in any really, even reading it to my grandchildren or whatever. So I'll give you a few sentences so you get the flavor of it. To be a human being is an honor, and we offer thanksgiving for all the gifts of life. Mother Earth, we thank you for giving us everything we need. Thank you, deep blue waters around Mother Earth, for you are the force that takes thirst away from all living things. We give thanks to green grasses that stood against our bare feet for the cool beauty you bring to Mother Earth's floor. Thank you, good foods from Mother Earth, our life sustainers, for making us happy when we are hungry. So there's a bit of the flavor of it. That's probably about a quarter of the contents of the book.
So Eileen, I've used that book quite a lot as a children's story at our church.
Right.
And I guess I felt like after I read it and kind of saw who had written it and, just done a little bit of research even on it, I felt good about it. And having said that, I felt like it was being offered from Indigenous people from that tradition to people. I also have actually a Thanksgiving address that is a very short version of it that I got from Syracuse cultural workers. And looks like you have the big one and I have the little one that folds up.
I was just going to mention that, Sherry. Yeah.
And this was also, I actually trust Syracuse cultural workers because they're very good about not culturally appropriating, I think. And also just when I read about it, I realized it was also being offered by Native artists. And so, yeah, I personally like that book, but I'd also be interested in hearing other people's thoughts on that.
To clarify, what did you say the book was written by a Haudenosaunee author or an Indigenous person?
Yes, I think
Oh,
that's
okay.
Jake Swamp.
I'm pretty certain Jake Swamp is the Haudenosaunee author.
Uh-huh.
I have to double check, but that was sort of part of the due diligence I did before I read it.
I was just going to say that I think the first time I encountered the Thanksgiving welcome was at the first ever Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition conference in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And it was the opening prayer, which we all stood for, and our host spoke this Thanksgiving prayer. It was probably between 20 minutes and a half an hour. And when he was finished, he said, well, that was the short version. In classic, Native humor, it was just great. And so again, it's just one of those things that's worth recognizing, that I think there's a whole lot more to it. And that, there are shorter versions that have become more well-known, or excerpts that are printed here or there. And I think to understand that if we're going to try to enter into it, that it is a prayer, this Thanksgiving address, and that we will, we're just trying to catch a glimpse of it, that we don't have complete understanding of what it means in its fullness. And I just think just a good dose of cultural humility.
That's helpful, Karen. Yeah, I just recently had a conversation with my friend Jonathan Nahar about this, because he lives in Syracuse, the traditional lands of Haudenosaunee, and has been in conversation with them or at events where they share the Thanksgiving address. and it's becoming more popularized or getting out there more, maybe because of Robin Wall Kimmerer's work or others. And I just asked him, like, would it be appropriate if I shared that at Thanksgiving, like as a sort of part of the complexity of, like, you know, naming Indigenous, acknowledging Indigenous peoples at our Thanksgiving table, but also the spirit of gratitude that they're coming from, and the debunking the myths around Thanksgiving. And his approach was, yeah, similar, that the whole Thanksgiving address is really like sometimes an hour or more long. And it's this prayer and this kind of like to respect the form of it. Like it's, each individual does a different one sometimes, and it's not just one that we can read or borrow easily. Almost like your, you know, grandmother or grandfather's Thanksgiving prayer. You wouldn't like write it down and exactly word for word and just read it, but it's in their own words, but there's a type to it. But he did say that that one that Sherry showed, and that I also got a copy of from that website, is one that was used with permission from the Haudenosaunee as an abbreviated version that they welcome sharing, and that I believe some of the funds from it go to the Onondaga Nation. So that was, I mean, this is coming through another friend and settler, but that's the approach that he took. So I found that really helpful in my own sharing of the Thanksgiving address.
I recall it might have been the Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery, like the one that we did sort of in with Syracuse, but on Zoom. Or it may have been something that I listened to alongside that. Part of cultural humility can also be an acknowledgement that this is a prayer that really belongs in the original language. And I don't know that language, even though that's the area where my ancestors landed into this continent. Yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful.
There was something I was thinking about as you all shared how your connections grew with different communities or didn't and such, that I was hanging around and showing up for Oak Flat Action for probably 3 years. And then there was this like, oh, I'm going to copy you next time there's a thing. Like at some point I was like, just now I'm an ally who's recognized or copied or included or welcomed into certain conversations. And there wasn't any like one point when that, it's sort of like, there's a lot of showing up that happened before any of that happened. And that was all really good for me, all of the showing up pieces, before I had anyone's cell phone number.
I want to just say thank you, because this is just exactly the kind of conversation I need to be a part of. So all of you said so many things that I have to go and tell Jenna, my director, all of them, because she really wanted to be here, but she couldn't. But, and then just a note to Luke that one of the things we've been talking about is how one of the maps I believe you gave us showed, it was like a map of Indian trails, indigenous. I don't know if you call them Indian trails when it's called an Indian trail map at that time, but now we say indigenous trails. But anyway, that one that goes beside the lake, our lake, actually connects to your trail. So I just want to connect with you at some point and see if there's any connection that we can make there between our trail and your trail. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Yeah, there are trails. The trail systems were amazing, and of course, the reality is our major highways run on top of a lot of these. So, yeah, it's got some long and complicated histories to it. And I think the one that goes through southern Michigan there is often called the Sauk Trail, which ends up connecting into this trail a little bit closer to Lake Michigan.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Part of it is just gaining a different reference for how people moved around. Like I was reading Edmund's book on the Potawatomi, and it kept talking about the Kankakee River and this river and that river. And I realized I've lived in Indiana for like 30 plus years, and I have no idea where these rivers are. So I had to get out a map and realize, you know, the Wabash River and the other thing I think we don't often talk about is why Fort Wayne was so important was because from Fort Wayne was a portage place, and you could go from there all the way down to the Ohio River and to the Mississippi River, or you could go north up into Lake Erie. So there's just a lot of trade going on, and Kelly talked about this too, how significant trade routes were and how extensive the economy was. Because my impression is, you know, these indigenous people, they each lived in their own little village, and they hunted around and grew crops, but not the kind of extensive trade networks that existed. So that's really been growing for me.
That reminds me of what Luke said about this part of this work is changing our relationship with land, you know, and doing the pilgrimage on the Trail of Death and co-leading that. We literally cross so many rivers, but you don't realize it because there's just bridges and roads, and you don't actually have to get out and touch the water. Yeah, we've been mapped into a different reality with our grid system and road system than you're speaking to, Eileen. Yeah, I love that.
One other thing, and then I have to go put my kids to bed.
Yeah.
But Anna McVeigh from Goshen College is presenting to our staff next Tuesday an annotated bibliography that she's put together on best practices for sharing Indigenous wisdom and culture in a camp setting. So I'll pass that on to you if you're interested. Yeah, it's been exciting to have someone dedicate, you know, a certain chunk of time to that for us, and I'm excited to see what can come of it. Mm-hmm. But there also may be some very gray areas. It's not like she can put this tidy package together and now we know how to be and we'll be perfect, right? Like Karen, that was I remember everything that was like, oh, perfectionism is like white supremacy at work in me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love how you're soaking it up, Amy. It's so good, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you guys.
Well, we'll be in touch. And yeah, those Goshen College students, they're doing great work. They reached out to Luke Gasho and I, and they're talking about how to form a repair network at Goshen College to like want to repair community. So Anna's part of that group. Yeah.
Yeah, that group is presenting tomorrow at noon. Are you joining by Zoom by chance or not?
I am. Yeah, okay. I'll be joining by Zoom, Luke.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, you don't get any of the food, I guess. So.
I wish. I did just want to highlight one last thing that you said, Luke, about consultation. I think is a really important avenue for relationship building that we don't often think of, that you intentionally sought out experts in their field related to a project that you're doing, Kelly and Blake. And it just makes me think about what other kinds of projects, whether that's related to land or, you know, not just land acknowledgements, but Kelly specifically asked for groups to think of consultation, and I think part of what goes behind that is honorarium and, you know, recognizing that labor and their time. So just to, I think, highlight that's something I recently did with our Trail of Death pilgrimage, was reached out to her, and we've had input from other Potawatomi people, but just to broaden the consultation base for how we share stories and who's sharing the story, like you mentioned. So that was helpful for me to hear again. Thanks, Luke.
And connected to that, just last week when Eileen and I were in the conversation with Kelly and Blake, I mean, I asked them directly, we want to pay for your input. What kind of remuneration piece should we be looking at? And they said, well, for us, we're on the clock. We're being paid for our work, within their cultural heritage center. And so they appreciated us saying that, but they also went on to say, if you're talking and working with people who are, let's say, elders, and they're not, supported through some institution or cultural center, then paying them is a really important thing to do. So the consultation is a really important piece, but then also always being upfront about we're not assuming that you can just do this gratis for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. I'm just thinking this summer, one of the Indigenous elders who spoke with our class from the Pokagon band, it turns out he had lost his job because of COVID, and COVID hit the tribe hard with the language center. Their casino had to shut down, and the casino funded the language revitalization work. And so being able to offer him an honorarium, I think, was important to show like this work is respected and valued, but sadly, their language revitalization work at least went on hold for a while. So yeah, naming that, the elders especially valuing their work when not always part of the staff role. Well, thanks everyone. I think I'm going to close this out. I appreciate you sticking around. This is good to have some debrief afterwards. Thank you. Take care. Good night.